Okay, we're starting with round 1, heat 1, seed number 1. This cheeky lad right here. This is easily the most popular comic I've ever made and is the first comic that was posted on this Phantastic account. You might not realize though that it was originally posted on my other account, Comics by Night, and it looked like this, where instead of Timmy, it was this lady giving Pink Reaper their cloak. That's because on my other account, it's a gag comic strip, which generally means that the comics are different every time I post. That's done in the spirit of these other amazing webcomic creators you're probably familiar with, like Extra Fabulous Comics, Safely Endangered, Sarah Anderson. And I enjoyed for a long while making comics that were different all the time. But after a couple of years, and especially after the Grim Reaper comics became popular, I did start to have ideas to build that character out. You can see that even before this one, I had posted other Grim Reaper comics before, and I even established who Timmy was in this one, where he exchanges a Pokemon card to not be claimed by death. Something like that's funny, and it does well online, but it isn't very useful in terms of building a consistent canon like I have with Phantastic. So those comics, like where Timmy dodges death, they're not part of Phantastic, so it doesn't really make sense, but they're all still up on that account if you do want to check them out. And it was supremely useful to me as I started learning how to make comics on that account to find my feet before starting Phantastic. If you go to the very first posts there, you'll see the first comics I ever started making drawn in pen and pencil. And in fact, as we come to review other comics in this Phantastic tournament, you will see redraws of ideas I had on Comics by Night, which I did want to steal and put into this project. So if, like a lot of others, this is your favourite comic, just make sure you vote for it on the carousel post at Something Phantastic. Even though it's a number 1 seed, make sure that you are voting for your favourite, because even though I expect this to move forward, if no one votes for it, it simply won't. There are 3 more comics in this heat too, so also hang around here if you want to hear about the other 3 comics. I'll be posting the next video tomorrow. Bye. Okay, next up is the lowest seed in the entire tournament, number 56. And this might be a good opportunity to quickly explain that. Just to give the tournament the right structure, I did have to seed everything myself. So if a comic isn't exactly where you expected it to be, that's probably why. That said, even though it's the lowest seed, I'm really glad comics like this exist. It's a silly throwaway gag that in particular benefits readers who are more familiar with the lore, because in Phantastic I've made a really big effort to establish who's who and what are the realms of existence that the comic takes place in, not just the real world, but also the dream realm, the underworld. And it was funny to me that underneath all of these things was something more monstrous and serious, and that thing is called Jerry. It's a silly gag, and if you wanted a clearer understanding of why the underworld is even so significant in the first place, you might benefit from reading my short stories, in particular Eternal Love. That's a short story, it's only 1 page long even, I think it's 2 pages long maybe, and it establishes why Stuart has his bow, why he's from the underworld, and how that has kind of changed over time. So check that out if you want a clearer, maybe understanding of why a joke like this is funny to me at least. And just before we go, I found the original draft for this comic, and you'll see that quite often I'm just scrabbling out an idea just to get it on paper before I forget. All that said, I'll be astonished if this goes through the heat. It's fighting the absolute number 1 favourite, so if for some reason this is your favourite, just make sure you're voting on that carousel post on Something Phantastic. I'll be back with a video tomorrow to talk about the next one. Bye. Okay, now we have the number 2 seed. This was particularly hard to decide, and I imagine many of you would have a different opinion on what the number 2 seed is. The reason I chose this is because Phantastic has a lot of different comics that operate in quite a lot of different genres these days, but this type of comic is really important to the identity of the comic. It is a cozy, life-affirming message about embracing how we move through life and we're never really the same kind of thing. It's like that saying, no man steps in the same river twice because he is not the same man and it is not the same river. That's something that's really important for me to convey, not just because it's probably something we can all relate to, but for Pink Reaper, who has existed basically for eternity, to learn to live after so long is such a key part of that character. And I've always found it kind of charming that that message is affirmed to them from Timmy, who's a young boy who maybe has this less filtered version of the world. And so for me, a message like that is super important. You can see that the first draft, when I scrabbled it out, was incredibly rough. I mean, you can barely tell what's going on. But in the end, it worked out. Oops, didn't knock the camera over me. But in the end, I think it turned out really nicely. I used this setup of them laying on the hill all the time. So again, it's another key piece of imagery that's essential to the comic's identity. And it has these warm, cozy autumnal colours as the sun's setting. Unlikely to beat out This Is Dope, but a very important comic, and that's why it's seeded so highly. So again, if it's your favourite, just make sure you're voting on that carousel post on the main account, Something Phantastic. And if you want to hear about the last comic in this heat, I'll be posting about it tomorrow. Bye. Okay, last up we have the second lowest seed in the tournament. It's this comic with Genie. The reason it's so low seeded is because the joke isn't that strong, but the real reason this one hasn't stood the test of time for me is I wasn't quite locked in on my style yet, and I used a very hard-edged brush to try and make it look hand-drawn, and I also killed all the blacks, replacing them with dark purples, trying to take a level of contrast out of the comic. There are so many good illustrators that either do their comic by hand or pretend that they do it by hand, even if it's on the iPad. And I thought I wanted to go in that direction at one point. But as you're probably aware, the comic is quite firmly established with a sense of style now, using a lot of saturation and high contrast, more like an animation almost. And so this is a low seed for that reason. But all that said, I'm still glad this is in the tournament, because I've actually been working on another project that more prominently features the Genie, and in that I'm not only improving comics like this, but I'm developing the character much more. And so when you next see the Genie, there'll be a much more important character, but I can't really say too much about it just yet. So even though it is up against some heavy hitters in this heat, if it is your favourite comic, just make sure you're voting for it on the carousel post at Something Phantastic. If you're considering one of the others, you can look at the previous videos I've posted where I've spoken more about what went into making those two. Because this is the last one of this heat, the voting is going to conclude shortly, so just make sure you've voted before that happens, and then next week I'll be speaking more about the comics in heat number 2, so I hope to see you then. Bye. Heat 2 begins with the third highest seed in the tournament. This comic does something that I hope all of the top seeds do, which is effectively convey the tone of the comic. I hope that as people read Phantastic, they feel certain ways, but if they could only read one comic, I imagine any top-seeded comic in this tournament would convey that pretty effectively. The reason I think this comic does is because we have our human character, we have our non-human character, and we have a subversion of an established monstrous trope. Like some others in this tournament, this is an updated version of a comic I posted on my other account, Comics by Night, where I originally had the idea, and of course anything with monsters or spookiness is a good fit for being redrawn and put into the Phantastic canon. There's a few ways in which you can see the two differ. For example, I think that the way I drew the guy laughing in the first draft is much enhanced in the new version. Also, when I started making comics, I didn't have the ideas to experiment with text formatting as much. In the original, we can see that the little boy's laugh is just written in the same writing as every other piece of text, but I do think that in the Phantastic version, the joke is enhanced by having this squiggly, curved font. I actually do like that the original has 2 additional panels. I think it's a nice subversion of the punchline, that the monstrous character isn't even as monstrous as they seem. However, when it comes to Phantastic, these days I'm really trying to keep comics down to 4 panels, and if I have to enhance them, I want them to be 9 panels. Then I can retain a square ratio for everything. So hopefully you feel that the Phantastic version of this comic is an enhancement on the old one, and if you do, just make sure that you're voting for this comic on the carousel post at Something Phantastic. I'll be back tomorrow to talk about the next one. Bye. The 54th seed is this one, and I think a comic like this is always going to make me laugh more than my wider audience. And that's totally fine. I get the impression that the people who read Phantastic generally enjoy more outrageous punchlines, more colourful characters, and comics that might imply a wider story that's being told. This comic is relatively standalone. It doesn't feature highly prominent characters, and of course the punchline is really silly. But it is really important to me to have a location that is a library, to have characters that read books and items, and sometimes even characters that are books. Even though I read less than I should these days, reading has always been a big part of who I am and has informed greatly the things I make. Sadly, I don't have as many books in the house as I used to, but the ones I've kept are incredibly important to me, and I can't really imagine letting those go. In fact, if you're ever interested in learning more about the books that I've kept and why I enjoy them, let me know and maybe we can do a little book tour. When it comes to comics that feature books though, it doesn't always have to be the craziest punchline. There will be another one that comes up in this tournament that for me has even more fun with wordplay. But this one, it's a nice little joke. This comic didn't take that long to make, though I must admit, drawing the books in the background of the first panel just was a pain. It took ages actually. What am I talking about? This comic did take ages to make, even though it doesn't look like it. So if you're a book lover too, or you just like silly wordplay, you might want to vote for this comic to go through the heat. And if you want to, just make sure you're voting on that Something Fantastic carousel post. I'll be talking about the next comic tomorrow. Bye. Autumn is my favourite season, and I love drawing backgrounds in my comics. So this already has a couple of the things I enjoy most when it comes to the process of making. However, the conversation in this comic is a classic Phantastic exchange. Even though Pink Reaper is a silly, goofy character, of course, a big part of their role is guiding Timmy, and the tutelage they provide is an essential part of that dynamic between the two characters. Of course, it's not that hard for anyone to understand why I might draw a comparison between being optimistic in Autumn and trying to have a character that deals with death convey that message. We've spoken before about how some comics are a redraw from my other account, but this comic actually is a redraw of a comic that was just posted early in the Phantastic days, back when the comic was called Pink Reaper. When I redrew this, I posted in my Discord the old one and the new comic, and I asked which people preferred. And actually, most people preferred the original, which at the time surprised me, but actually on reflection is not that surprising. I actually think that in a lot of ways the original looks more like a webcomic. It looks much more hand-drawn, and it's flatter in a way that conveys this webcomic idea that it was quick to make. I made it and then I put it straight onto the internet. No one is wrong to feel that way, of course. The reason I prefer the original is I've really enjoyed using gradients in the backgrounds more recently to really sell this sense of real light spilling into the backgrounds. For me too, rightly or wrongly, I feel that the way I draw now is an enhanced version of how I used to draw. That's important to me because I do want to keep going with Phantastic for a very long time, and I would love the opportunity to release books. I would, if I were to dream big, pitch it as an animated series maybe, and I actually do make my card game that I sell at conventions. For me, I think the new style fits better into these products, be they card games, be they books, be they anything. And that is just a small reason of why I draw the way I draw now. I would love to hear your thoughts on if the older style of this comic was better than the new one, and if so, why? But regardless of how you feel, if this comic is the one you want to go through the heat, just ensure you're voting for it on the @Something Fantastic carousel post. I'll be posting about the final comic in this heat tomorrow. Bye. Last up in this week's heat, we have this comic. This is, of course, a play on a classic phrase that you see printed on mugs or have pinned up on people's office space. Don't talk to me until I've had my coffee. Just to really over-explain the joke, because that's the funniest thing of all, the joke here is, of course, that Stuart just needs to have a sip of his coffee before he's ready to talk to Pink Reaper. But when Pink Reaper realises it's herbal tea, we understand that Stuart is just a grumpy monster who doesn't want to talk to anyone. Sure, not the funniest comic in the world, but comics like this need to exist, in my opinion, especially when you're sustaining a webcomic over such a long period of time. I admire people who post infrequently and only post excellent comics. I sometimes wish that I did that. But because I established early on that I would post pretty regularly, a comic like this is still valuable because now we further understand who Stuart is, and it, like we said in the other video, maybe smirk when we see this comic, and it's a nice thing to see in the feed. I posted a follow-up to this comic featuring Elder Rich, but it didn't make it into the tournament. But you can see here, I'm using the same setup, but for a different punchline. And that is very much like this first comic, where really the main goal is to understand that Elder Rich is this big monstrous guy who can transform and doesn't really tolerate much. I actually think this second comic was the first time I paired these two characters together, because I knew that I wanted there to be a dynamic between them in the future. And it might take a while, but you're going to see more interactions between these two characters, either in this tournament, but maybe in something else I have planned in the future. So maybe the tea and coffee drinkers of the world will vote this comic through. If that's you, when you want to see it advance through the tournament, just make sure you're voting on the carousel post at Something Phantastic, and I'll be announcing the winners of this heat next week before I start talking about the next 4. Bye. We're in week 3, and the 5th highest seed is this one. This comes from an era of the comic where almost all of them featured Pink Reaper and Timmy in cozy, wholesome little moments. If you're a newer follower of the comic, you might not know that for a few years the comic was called Pink Reaper. It wasn't called Phantastic. And back in those days, all the comics, of course, featured Pink Reaper and usually Timmy just doing cute things together. The rebranding only happened when there were so many characters and so many more stories that I was cooking that I felt a more universal name would be appropriate to convey that there's a lot more going in the comic these days. There's not really that many tidbits I can reveal about the makings of this comic, but I do want to draw your attention to 2 things. Firstly, for anyone that has a good enough screen, you might see the cute little cat, dog, fish and duck on the socks. But the main thing for me is the top panel, right, is kind of like the standard setup of Pink Reaper standing next to Timmy. And I didn't realize until I'd kind of drawn the whole comic that when you stack the 4 panels next to each other, you get this weird, like, squashed, disproportionate Pink Reaper. Maybe that'll give it minus points, I don't know. But if you do want this comic to go through in the heat, just make sure you're voting on the carousel post on at Something Phantastic. Next comic in the heat is coming up tomorrow. Bye. Today we're looking at this comic. This is one I particularly enjoy, actually. It's a low seed because probably if you were to survey everyone that reads the comic, I don't think this would score highly, and I am generally trying to reflect that in the seeding. I enjoy this comic for a couple of reasons. I enjoy making different pairings to what is more commonly seen. We don't always see Elder Rich and Timmy interact. And for me, I do quite like the joke, to be honest. I don't actually know if it is always clear to people what joke I'm going for here, so just to explain it in case. There's a classic joke of 2 kids in a trench coat, one of them with their head coming out the top to make it seem as if they're as tall as an adult so they can go into 18 plus films. I'm setting up that concept with this joke, and I think it's implied that Timmy's head will be the one above the trench coat. So for me, the joke is funny when not only does 2 kids in a trench coat not work anyway, but of course the head that's being revealed is the one of this eldritch creature. I've gotten the impression from the few times I've posted this that intention isn't always clear. Just in case, there you go, there's the explanation. This one wasn't so hard to draw, but it was fiddly, because I just had a really clear idea that I wanted the cinema attendee to be in one of those classic booths that I've seen on film and TV, but we don't actually have them in England, and I'm not even sure if they're that common in America, but I did eventually find a picture I wanted a reference for this kind of thing. But if you are watching from America, maybe tell me if that's no longer a thing or never was a thing. My last thought as well is I have enjoyed to put 2 speech bubbles in the final panel. I would say conventional wisdom is that you want to build up to a punchline and deliver that punchline in the last panel. But there's something I enjoy of revealing your punchline, which in this case is an image, and then almost having like a little suffix or a little after credits moment. I think stuff like that is a good little reminder that there are characters within this comic, because if the punchline was just no, it would have been fine, but it's not the worst thing in the world to be reminded that there's little Timmy inside the coat panicking. Anyway, those are my thoughts. If you want this comic to go through in the heat, just make sure you're voting for it on That's Something Phantastic. I'll be talking about the next comic tomorrow. Hello. Next up we have this comic. This is the 6th Highest Seed. This is a comic I think a lot of people enjoy, myself included, because the setup is kind of loose. But I do think it's generally true that characters with horns... look cool, and that was just something I wanted to experiment with. So of course through the comic we have these different transformations of things that look ridiculously better once you put horns on them, even if it's a bit illogical, of course. Astute viewers, when I originally posted this, noticed that the person playing the trumpet in the gig panel ends up playing a French horn. But the main punchline here is buried between the start and end of the comic, because I've established this rhythm. Something's bad, add horns. Something's bad, add horns. But the real joke is the second to last panel. It says, if you have negative self-talk, get therapy. And then we follow that up straight away with another panel doubling down on the horns setup and punchline. I'm not educated in the world of what makes things funny or not, but I knew that slipping in this subversion of something I had established within the comic would be funny, and that's why it's in there like that. You'll notice as well, even though I said the other week that I'd try to keep things in 4 or 9 panel formats, this one's 6. The reason was I had considered making this a 9 panel comic to begin with, but I'm already not the fastest illustrator, and so even doing 6 panels was already taking me quite a while, and I hadn't really got a clear idea of what could go in the additional panels. So when I come to post comics like this, I don't know what I'll have done in the carousel this week, but I usually just post the single panel version that you can swipe across in social media rather than ever post it in full, because I don't really like how comics like this look when they're stacked tall and thin. But I'll show you how files like this are set up, because I always work in a 4 panel format, just in case the comic I'm doing does end up being only 4 panels long. So when they end up becoming longer and I don't use all those panels, I kind of have to draw, and leave blank spaces here. It is a bit of a faff, because you'll have 4 panels here. Jeepers, that light is bright. Because my template is 4 panels long, if I do want to make a comic 9 panels, I have to have 4 panels, 4 panels again, and then I have a whole third version of the template that I just use for one of the panel squares. And that's in part because I have this script on my iPad, which I think I stole off a comic creator called Chris Halbeck. I think he posted the shortcut process in a comic making Discord. But I have this script that trims comics from 4 panels into single panels, and it's supremely useful as a time saver. Okay, the brightness will be horrendous, but you can kind of see I'm in my Photos app here with the comic. If I scroll all the way to the bottom, I have this shortcut called Comic Trim. If I press it, something happens, and it adds the single panel format to my photo reel. That ended up being a lot of talk about how I do certain things rather than the comic itself, but hopefully you have a clear enough sense of it anyway, and if you want to vote it through the heat, just make sure you're voting on that carousel post as usual at Something Fantastic. There's one more comic in the heat which I'll be talking about tomorrow. Bye. Hello. Last up this week we have the 51st Seed. It's this comic, which is pretty rare to be honest, where it features Alex Kawabata. Maybe more of a tertiary character in the comic. This guy is the brother of Simon, who runs the Scythe store. The Scythe store hasn't featured in this tournament yet, because there are so many comics. I think it would probably flood the structure I have for this tournament. But I do have an idea for the future of how to build that into some kind of similarly structured tournament. So I'll let you know about that later. But anyway, this comic is a play on the trope that if you just honk at something bothering you in the road, obviously nothing's going to change. But because Alex is an inventor, he is so optimistically oblivious that he is just surprised someone else sharing the road with him knew that his bike, if it hears a honk, goes super fast. It's almost like a 2-parter comic. The other one wasn't in the tournament, so I'll just show you now. Because he's an inventor and we've established that he made rockets on his bike, I did a comic of him having rockets in his boots with not so great consequences. But an interesting little thing perhaps is that when I was showing my mum my behind the scenes processes a few years ago, I tried to draw a comic in front of her, which usually I don't draw in front of anyone, or just draw on the sofa. But I drew that image of the rocket boots firing up in front of her with no draft, just tried to draw a final straight away, which is why it doesn't look quite as good as I feel like I can draw these days, but it's a little memory I have of drawing this comic with her, which was nice. In a similar spirit, the other interesting thing to note about the comics that feature Alex is that Simon, who runs the Scythe store, and Alex, who is in this comic, they're both brothers, and when I had a need to name them, they are named after my two oldest friends, both from childhood. Alex, who is a pretty successful voice actor actually, you might know him on TikTok, and Simon. We all went to school together and I've known them both for years, and it was nice for me to find a place for them inside the comic. So if you like science or inventions or anything in that world, consider voting for this comic on @somethingfantastic. I'll reveal the results of this heat next Monday and talk about some more comics afterwards. Bye. I made this comic years ago. Like quite a few others in the tournament, this was originally posted on my first ever comics account, Comics by Night, and back then it looked like this. So as you can see, it was quite easy to update, and I felt like because it featured a skeleton, it was an obvious candidate to bring into Phantastic, because the main character is a skeleton. That said, I don't really know if this comic fits that well into the characterization I've established for Pink Reaper, and I think a good way to demonstrate that is to show you that animation, because it's not online anymore. So here you go. One thing you'll notice right away is the voice for Pink Reaper. It's something I've always struggled with when doing little animations. And that's because Pink Reaper is meant to represent this force of the universe, this dynamic presence that isn't male, isn't female, and I didn't want to give it a deep, somber voice like you so often hear when death is in animated media. So the compromise I used was to do kind of random sound effects. They were inspired by little sound bites you get when a dialogue box pops up on an RPG video game. And while that approach might work for that animation in isolation, over time I've come to realize that really tonally, that animation is quite far away from what I'm trying to establish for Phantastic these days. I want Phantastic to be a comic that is primarily about humour and making people laugh, but I do want it to also reveal a story as every comic layers on top of itself and the characters develop and grow. A joke like that in a comic like this is fine in my opinion, because you don't have to think too hard about it. But when you're watching an animation for a few seconds and you start to think, oh, is that what that Pink Reaper character sounds like? Then I'm starting to make people see the character in a way that I just don't see it myself. So yeah, that animation got pulled from my social channels, as did some others that I made in a similar style, but the comic has survived. Maybe something to consider if you want to vote it through in the tournament. And if you're unsure, I have 3 more behind the scenes videos coming every day for the rest of this week. So I'll see you tomorrow. Bye. This comic is just a silly little joke. It's kind of ironic that yesterday I spoke about how I moved into a place with the comic that I wanted everything to layer on top of itself to tell this big, grand story. But then today I'm just backing my way into telling this joke by any means necessary. All it is just because Elder Rich is a kind of big fish monster, I wanted to find a way to make a joke about something smelling fishy. I don't want to go into more detail than is needed, but it felt like ultimately the way to tell that joke was to dress up both characters as Sherlock and as Watson. I also ended up changing this first panel to what you see now, because the original had a big blood stain on the floor, and really that's not something I should be posting in a comic this gentle overall. I also managed to find the original draft of this comic. You can see the pool of blood I mentioned there in the draft. This is how it ends up getting finished. I didn't realise I wanted to cross-hatch it at the time, but otherwise, it's pretty much a 1-for-1. There's also this trend in comic making where maybe if a joke is falling a little flat, you'll put more detail than is needed into the final panel. I don't want to specifically do that, but I did use hatched shading in the final panel just to kind of take it home.
There's no real reason to do that. I just wanted to do it one day, and I think stylistically it looks kind of fun. It actually does weirdly go with the Sherlock Holmes and Watson theming, but I think there is a little bit of truth in the fact that drawing like that in your last panel is a way of admitting that the joke isn't that hilarious. Those are really the main reasons this is the 48th highest seed. It's definitely on that lower end. It gets points for being pretty well drawn. I think it's a later Phantastic comic than a lot of others in this tournament, but really ultimately I think it suffers from being relatively divorced from the main canon of storytelling that's going on. So vote for it if you want to. Leave a like on the main post on the @somethingfantastic account. There's 2 more comics to talk about this week, so I'll see you again tomorrow. Bye. This is my favourite comic of the week. This has happened before in the tournament where the highest seed is my personal favourite. In this case, I think it's because this hits a sweet spot in tone for me, where it is playful and it is silly, and it can only exist by the marriage of my mortal characters and my fantastic characters. And whereas sometimes the punchline is sometimes very sweet and saccharine, in this case, it is a relatively dark joke. Personally, I think it's gentle enough that it does fit within what I've established for Phantastic, but I like that this comic isn't one I'm sometimes shy to show others because it's too cute or it's too wholesome. The idea that you would play this joke on your relative using your ghost friend to pretend you're dead, it is messed up, but that's what makes it so funny. You might have heard me mention earlier in the year that I'm making a book of comics as well. While a lot of that book's focus is on creating small little narrative arcs out of everything I've made, there will be standalone comics too, like this one. To make sure that the book has value for people that have already read all my online comics, the sequel to this comic is totally original to it. So while I can't show you, of course, here's a little preview, and if I have updates on that project later in the year, I'll be sure to let you know. So if you're like me and this is your favourite in this week's heat, just make sure you're voting it through on @somethingfantastic. 1 more comic left to talk about, which I'll be posting about tomorrow. See you then. This comic plays into a much-loved trope that I've established in Phantastic, wherein Stuart just can't seem to keep his face in one piece. For long-term readers of the comic, you're probably aware that what I'm playing on is a kind of mini-series I have that feature Elder Rich and Stuart. Anytime Elder Rich speaks his Eldritch native language, because it's so accursed and evil whenever it's spoken, poor Stuart gets his face blasted off. Those comics are among my favourite, but they're not in the tournament at the moment, so I can only reference them in comics like this. The reason for that is I'm considering doing something after this tournament is done. Right now I'm focusing on standalone comics that aren't part of a series, and I'd be interested to see if anyone following has an appetite to see a similar, smaller tournament after this one that features on my narrative storylines. Some of those things are the things that Phantastic is best known for, and I do think I'll need to develop a space to talk about them in the future. But for right now, we're just talking about this comic. I also found the draft for this one. You can see it here. You can see that compared to the draft, I considered having Stuart react to the beeping alarm by suggesting that I kind of overlay a speech bubble here, but in practice, it made this 3rd panel feel far too busy. We already have a sound effect, this overlay text here, a speech bubble. It just would have been too noisy, and it would have taken away from the fact that this beep noise is growing louder and stronger. I would also say that I actually prefer the drawing of Stuart getting his face blown off in this draft. When I tried to recreate it in the final comic, it just didn't come through. The big open eyes of the skeleton, they just didn't seem to have the impact that I felt like I got by him squinting his eyes, even though it's meant to be his skull. And because you're all probably here for the inside scoop, I'll admit to something. The background for these shots in the lab are actually stolen from my own work. I'm developing a card game in the background. I sell it at conventions, but I haven't spoken about it much on my main Phantastic channels. But the background of this comic just uses the background that I have for the Inquisitron card art. Talking about the card game I'm developing is a whole other thing, so that can be its own set of future videos. But if in the future you ever pick that up and then you notice this comic looks familiar, it's the stolen background. And that's it for the week. You're probably already aware by this point that I'm running a tournament, and the most engaged with comic of the week advances in that tournament. So whether it's this one I showed you today or 3 of the others, just make sure you're doing something internety on those posts so that I know you like it and I can advance it through. As usual, I'll announce the winners on Monday, and then there'll be 4 more behind the scenes to show you. So I'll see you then. Bye. I don't actually think you should vote this comic through this week. The reason I say that is, while I think this is a good comic, I don't really know if it's a good comic because it's set in the Phantastic universe. And the reason for that, like a few others, is that this was taken from my first ever comics account. Okay, I'm officially old because I'm reshooting this. I'm going to show you the original video from this angle. Because I usually shoot continuously in one video file, I forgot. And you can just see now in the kind of dark reflection of my iPad, I'm turning off the video now. So here we are, start again. Anyway, here's the original of the comic. And as you can see, it is an exact one-to-one redraw. I do think in some ways this joke works because Pink Reaper is not only a silly character, but because they don't have a tongue, they take all these performative steps and can't really taste anything. And if I'm honest, I actually prefer the original. Even though the expression is incredibly simple, that expression is much closer to how I pictured delivering the punchline. Pink Reaper has always been a hard one to convey emotion through because while I cheat and change the eye shape, even though the head is a skeleton, that mouth shape is just too much of a push to cheat and warp, which is why you might sometimes see me instead turning Pink Reaper's head into an entire circle, just so I can get some kind of emotion expressed. Here's an example of what I mean. It's a little preview for an exclusive comic in the book I'm preparing. That's why I'm saying I had a change of heart, because while this comic is fine, the original is fine too. It didn't need to be redrawn. And this is similar to some of the points I made last week when I showed you the animation. As I develop Phantastic and I dial in who the characters are and the stories I'm trying to tell, my focus has become less about making a one-off comic that is funny but doesn't really have a place in the universe, and instead prioritizing a canon of characters that interconnect and tell stories over time. So some considerations to take into account there. I appreciate my opinion is going to be very different from many people who just log into Instagram and like the things they see. Far fewer people put in the amount of thought into the comic and its universe than I do as someone who makes it. So no hard feelings if you do like it. I do want you to like it. I'm still interested to see how the tournament results play out every week, especially after that big upset a couple of weeks ago. And don't forget, I have 3 more behind the scenes videos coming up every other weekday for the rest of this week. So I'll see you tomorrow. Bye. This is a really nice comic in my opinion that is a good representation of Phantastic, especially the dynamic between Pink Reaper and Timmy. I'm also not sure if we've had any comics set on the hill yet, but the hill is such a classic location. It's something I use all the time and I just like to draw it. It gives me a sense of peace, so I hope it does the same for people who read the comic. Like a lot of the comics where Pink Reaper is offering advice to Timmy, the words I'm using here are informed by advice I've either gathered through my life, I've heard directly from people in my life, and then I modify them through the lens of either my own experience or how I think the characters in my comic would say it. It might be obvious to say that there is a portion of me in all of my characters in Phantastic, and this idea of Timmy feeling guilty for not doing enough is something I constantly say to the people in my life. There's a part of my brain that knows I work incredibly hard on my professional career, which isn't making comics, by the way, and on my hobby of building Phantastic, not just through the comics, but through my bigger projects as well. I know that I work into the night, and I know that I compromise events in my real life to make this a reality, but it's the times after that in which I play a video game or play some tennis, or I do hang out with friends. I can often find myself coming back to those moments and thinking, that was 2 hours I could have spent doing a comic or developing one of the longer term projects. The message in this comic is important for anyone to keep in mind, certainly for me, because the only way we can really achieve anything is by achieving a portion of that something, bit by bit, day by day. I don't think I've spoken about it before, but the reason that especially applies to me in Phantastic is because before all of this stuff, I had always wanted to be a storyteller, and I thought my format was going to be books. After I graduated, I spent years writing a couple of novels, and I did nothing but do that. And the result of those books, I just knew wasn't quite right. It wasn't good enough to pursue publication. they didn't really convey what I was trying to convey very successfully. And I did feel that in hindsight I had wasted some of that time. Now that I'm older, I don't necessarily feel that way. I did learn a lot by having such a strong commitment to those projects. But the thing that brought me to comic making was the perceived lack of stress, that I can just make 4 panels. Hopefully someone will enjoy that comic, but then I know that over time, as I make more and more comics, the cumulative effect of that work is that thing that I have developed and I can be proud of. That was true when I started making comics on my gag strip, Comics by Night. But that is especially true with Phantastic, because not only did I for many years usually have a fresh comic once or twice a week to develop the world of Phantastic, but any of you following more closely will know that I also write short stories, I have the game, and all of these things are Phantastic. In terms of the drawing of this comic, I don't have the paper draft, I don't know where it is, but I do have the digital draft. So here you go. I'll be incredibly transparent because the draft shows as much that sometimes when it comes to me making a comic, I don't always have to draw from scratch. With the time commitment that is already implicit in making a reoccurring comic, sometimes I just reuse poses. And you can see that these poses are reused. And the main way to tell that, if you're unsure, is because Pink Reaper has a certain thickness of the outline. Timmy's is much thinner. I'm pretty sure that what happened in this case is that I took this pose from another comic and then I blew it up to fit the size of this comic, which is why the line thickness is so heavy. And of course, the background is already fully realized in the draft. That means that I've taken this background from another comic. However, this is just the draft, and I always draw my comics from scratch, even if the draft of the comic is heavily informed using drawings I've done before and backgrounds I've done before. Even if they're incredibly similar, I want each comic to feel original, and you can see that in the layers here, I have redrawn the tree. I've got the tree trunk behind the leaves, I've got the night sky behind the tree, and so on. And so it's a simple process. I just draw around the characters in a thick, dark brush, and I often do my backgrounds without a pen outline. I just kind of do the fill, if that makes sense. One thing I'm noticing looking at this in retrospect is how, when it comes to trying to show off the constellations in the sky, because iPad screens are so high fidelity and they're so bright, it looked clear to me at the time. But I have noticed since posting that these characters in the sky aren't particularly clear. They're certainly not clear in this printed version unless you really look for it. When I was reviewing the layers of this just before I filmed, I realised that I had tried so many different opacities and treatments of those constellations to make them readable. And I think that if I just turn on an additional additive layer, this one, they are so much clearer. It's possible that at the time I felt like it was too obvious and too in your face, that as Pink Reaper is giving this inspirational message, that they're also seeing both of them in the sky. That said, I think this is better. Clarity is a huge part of webcomics being easy and fun to read, and I think that when I come to post this week, I'm actually going to use this one with the brighter constellation than the one I have saved in my file archive. I quite like cute comics like this with a positive message, and it's similar to one that didn't quite make the tournament. Let me know if that was the right decision. But I do have the paper draft for it, so I wanted to show you something at least. Here's the paper draft for this other comic. I don't know if it looks familiar or not, but here is the finished comic. The reason this one didn't make it into the tournament was, even though it is quite nice and cute, it does get memed upon from time to time. The idea of Timmy shooting across the sky like a shooting star is a lovely image to me, but whenever I post it, I often get a lot of comics saying, "Ah yes, Timmy, you'll shoot into the sky and explode with no remains to be found." Yeah, that does make me laugh a bit when I see those comments, but it just played upon my mind slightly, which meant that that comic didn't make the cut. I think that's going to be a really long video. There's this little notification you get when you edit in Instagram edits that if a video is longer than 3 minutes, it's not going to show it to people that don't already follow you. So probably this video is not going to do very well on the account, but I want to leave it at this length for the few of you that are following, because I think those thoughts about how to build something big over time are really important to me, and probably to any of you that are making something of your own. So I think I can take the hit of having a video not perform particularly well this week, just so I can preserve that message. Do let me know if longer videos are of interest at all. It's not really something I'm planning to do, primarily focusing on short content. Finally said content. I've been trying to avoid it. And if longer videos are of interest, it's something I can consider doing in the future, but I'm going to try and rein it back in for the rest of this tournament and keep them as short as they have been. So that means that tomorrow's video is probably more like what you'd come to expect. So I'll see you then. Bye. I made this comic after finding out about ants on a log. That is not something that I've come across in my childhood or adulthood in England. I'm sure there are some families that do it, but I get the impression it's primarily a North American thing. I came to find that because I had already set up this comic, but I didn't know what the punchline was. So if you want to imagine this comic like this without the third panel, this is very similar to how I would create a lot of my comics in the early days of Pink Reaper. Because I knew that Pink Reaper was this eternal being and they were essentially out of touch, a lot of the early comics drew a contrast between their immortal existence and the follies of mortality, if you will. I don't have any kind of draft for this. You can tell it's pretty old in comparison to most of the others in the tournament, but I do remember setting up these 3 panels way in advance of the 4th one. Because I don't have the original draft, and because the message of this comic isn't particularly deep or complex, I realized that I don't really have anything to put into a video about this comic, even though the whole point of this series is that I'm meant to be giving behind the scenes views and thoughts about how I felt at the time of making that comic. So this is going to be a one-off, but I figured I might as well go to the shops and actually try Ants on a Log, because I've never had it before. Okay, so I don't think it's a particularly complex recipe. Celery, peanut butter, Tesco own brand, and a scoop. That end looks gross. I'm gonna just start fresh. Now the comic didn't actually specifically refer to ants on a log, so I'll try it without the raisins first. Okay, genuinely the first time I've ever tried this. Okay, that actually wasn't too bad. The first bite of celery was gross because I don't like celery, but very quickly it just ended up tasting entirely like peanut butter. But I felt like maybe I put too much on it. Okay, now I'm going to try it with raisins. Genuinely much better. The sweetness of the raisins almost entirely counteracted the celery, even though I put much less peanut butter on that time. Well done, America, I guess, for inventing that. Maybe that's something I'll add to my diet. I heard it's kind of healthy. I don't know how true that is, if it includes peanut butter. However, I already feel like I've lost a portion of myself in doing whatever that was in a series that's meant to be about how I make comics. Is that what the internet does to people? They get so desperate they eat celery on camera. I think I'm just going to stick to behind the scenes comic stuff. So I'll post the results like usual on Monday, and then more normal videos resume on Tuesday. Bye. This might be my favourite comic that I've ever made, and I think the reason for that isn't just to do with the quality of it, but where it fits into everything I've made to date. Because Phantastic's focus is on making people laugh with quick, silly humour, a comic like this exists in a slightly separate space where we're trying to make people relax and feel something a bit different. Personally, I'm a sucker for those moments in comedies where there's a really sincere, heartfelt moment, the kind of thing you see at the tail end of a sitcom series or in the denouement of a film. And I have had moments like that in Phantastic before, because Pink Reaper was previously the Grim Reaper. I have explored many times the aspect of that grimness that they have inside themselves. It's also one of my favourite images, using this rainbow to shelter both Pink and Winnie from the rain. So here we have the original iPad file where I made the whole comic, and we have the rainbow here. The way I actually made that was by having a string of colours like this, and then just kind of warping them until they ended up looking like a rainbow. It's obviously much nicer than that, but once I had the arched string of colours, I applied a few different treatments on the rainbow. Here we have sharp flaring edges that are very subtle, just to make it feel more like real light, and a set of stacking layers here to make it shine much brighter than the rest of the comic. I'm actually working on an animation of this comic for something I'll tell you about another time, but I had a really nice idea the other day to use wind chimes as the sound effect for the rain hitting the rainbow. So I'll show you a preview of that now. It's cool, right?
So don't forget to show this comic some love if you want to. All that comic content exists over on Something Phantastic, whereas this is only for the behind the scenes. Speaking of, I have 3 more videos coming for this week, so I'll talk about another comic tomorrow. Just follow, so I can see you then. Bye. Puns. That's the name of the game with Ghosty and most of the comics that feature them. This is an older comic that has been kind of reinvented recently. I'll show you what I mean. Because in comics that feature Ghosty right now, I always outline them in blue. The comics that feature them are more saturated and rounded off in a cuter, more appealing way, in my opinion. I mean, compare it to the original. I wasn't that bold with my saturation, and the setting was quite minimal. I've since established there's a city behind the hill that most of the characters talk on, so now that's included in this redraw. And because it is a redraw, I've censored the top, because this is a comic I'm making for the book that I'm preparing at the moment, and this 4-panel comic is actually a combination of 2 Ghosty comics, because I felt that I could tell this 4-panel joke in 2 panels and squeeze in an extra gag at the start. And that's why preparing that book has been such a rewarding process, because I've been able to revisit ideas that I knew I wanted to include, but I've been able to punch them up and enhance them dramatically since they were first posted online. It's all part of making a definitive resource for Phantastic, not just copy-pasting all the comics I've already put online in a series of pages so that I can flog it to some people that already follow me. So I hope you stick around for when I have more announcements about that materializing into the world. That said, you might just like this comic the way it is, and if you do, then vote for it over on @somethingphantastic, link in the caption. Because on this account, of course, we're just talking about behind the scenes thoughts of making comics, of which there are 2 more coming this week, so I hope to see you again tomorrow. Bye. Why is that so weird? In this comic, Timmy is aged up and starting to put into practice many of the life lessons that Pink Reaper has taught them over the many, many comics I've published so far. This is actually the first time that I've aged up Timmy in the comics. And the reason I've done that is because I've already established that we do see Timmy in other stages of their life. I wrote a short story a while ago called Timmy, Timothy, Tim, which is about 3 epochs in Timmy's life, where we see them in various states of learning and acceptance of their complex relationship with Pink Reaper. I actually really like the cover for that story. I'll put it on screen now, and I show those 3 epochs through the 3 stages of a tree's life for the short story cover, which I think is really cool, if it's okay to say. And the other reason I aged Timmy up is because I'm wrestling with a slightly more mature theme in this comic, and I want to reflect that maturity with the age of the character. Because really, this comic is about the tension between the fact that in our lives amazing things happen, but so many not amazing things happen too, and how can you reconcile a fulfilling life with an experience that is plagued with mundanity? Perhaps that's something a lot of people can relate to, where you're just sitting on the bus waiting to get from somewhere to somewhere else, and you just realise that in those moments you're not necessarily living to your fullest. That's something I felt a lot as an adolescent, and the way I have reconciled those feelings is by accepting that because I'm in charge of any action I take, even the ones in between the key events, everything I choose to do is a meaningful action, because otherwise I could just lay in bed all day and never do anything. That really is just a snapshot of the message I'm trying to convey, and I'd really recommend reading this comic in full to get a clearer sense of the message I'm trying to convey with this comic specifically. The full comic is on @somethingphantastic, where I post all my comics. If you like it or leave a comment or something like that, I'll mark that as a score for this big tournament I'm running. Feel free to check out the 3 videos I've posted before this week. I'll be posting the results of everything I've discussed this week on Monday, before posting for the next 4 days, telling you my behind the scenes thoughts on some more comics. So I hope to see you then. Just follow so you'll know when those go up. Bye. Dream Skimmer experiences many elements of the subconscious, the bad as well as the good, and in this comic they've actually drifted into a nightmare, and we can see that they're helping assuage the person having it from their fears. I'm not actually sure if I'm in love with the way I drew the nightmare in this comic. I have this kind of glitchy effect in the sky, and it's alright, but I don't know if really this comic feels as scary and horrific as this person seems to be indicating it is. However, I do like
that in this comic, unlike most, Dream Skimmer is exerting a level of influence to help calm the dreamer and replace the scary eyes with a pretty starry sky. There is an in-universe reason for that. I don't want Dream Skimmer to just be this passive, drifting observer of dreams, and so future stories are going to show just why Dream Skimmer is the person that they are, and why they only seem to exist in dreams in the first place. So I'm excited to share those with you in future comics, which I will talk about here, I'm sure, but they'll mainly be posted on that main comics account at Something Fantastic. Link and caption. So as you're probably aware by this point, the reason I'm talking about all these comics is because they're all part of a tournament to find the best one I've ever made. And you can vote this one through by liking it, leaving a comment, something like that on @somethingfantastic. If you're still undecided, there's one more behind the scenes video that I'm going to show you tomorrow. So I'll see you then. Bye. Every comic doesn't have to be complex and full of depth, and today's comic is a good example of that. Pink Reaper is a skeleton and without eyeballs, so they are ripe for opportunity to make puns related to that fact. The only other things perhaps worth pointing out about this comic is how it's visually a little different from the majority of comics I make. Once again, as I've discussed before, you can see that with this comic I'm using a rougher brush just to simulate perhaps something that feels a bit more hand-drawn and casual. But actually I think that doesn't work with this comic specifically, because the only way I could show that Pink Reaper's fingers were going into their eye sockets was with this fading effect, and that for me really jars with the overall aesthetic of this comic. You might also be able to tell, though it's subtle, I shaded the boxes here. I think it's something I'm copying from Extra Fabulous, who seems to do it in their comics. But it's too subtle in this comic, and it's also just not something that particularly goes well with my style. I think if it was less subtle, there's a chance that it could fly in my comic, but really it's not something I've stuck with over time. You'll probably hear artists say a lot that you should mimic your peers and copy people that you really respect and want to draw like. And there is truth in that, but I've definitely noticed that with my own body of work, the comics that I've posted where I try these new things, because they are instantly plumbed in to the overall project of Phantastic, it does mean that I have quite a lot of outliers that visually jar or just don't even look as good as some others, even if I nailed that particular stylistic attempt. Because really, now that I feel like I know what I'm doing better, I want Phantastic to feel like a cohesive comic and adventure where you're not being distracted by my personal art journey. That means that for that book I'm preparing, like I told you, there are comics that I want to include that just stand out too much, and so I've had to redraw a lot of those so that when people open the comic, especially if they're unfamiliar with Phantastic, what they receive is a consistent product full of art that seems to have been made with intent by one person. That said, there are always exceptions to every rule, and you should never not try something for fear that your comic will become popular one day in the future. In fact, I don't know if it's next week or the week after, but there is a comic I don't want to redraw that is in a totally different style, because I just like it. I feel like tonally it fits with that message. Here's a panel from that comic, just so you know what I mean, but I'll talk more about that when the comic is up in the tourney. So if this comic is something you like, just make sure you're liking it over on the main comics account at Something Fantastic. By the end of this week, I'll actually have been talking about comics almost every day for 2 months. And I'm planning to continue going not only tomorrow, but I think the first round of the tournament I'm running to find the best comic I've made runs for at least another 5 weeks. After that, thankfully, the big swathe of comics will have been reduced to like a quarter of what it was at the start, so the final 2 rounds will be much quicker. But I do have plenty more to say about those, so if you're interested in learning more about how I make comics and how you can maybe take some elements of my learning and apply it to your own, just follow and keep watching. I'll have a new video tomorrow, so I'll see you then. Bye. We're ending the week on a sad note with another sad comic. I'll show you. So much like Tuesday's comic, really look deeper into the fact that Pink Reaper, despite all their jokes and optimism, is a being that holds a huge onus upon their shoulders, the burden of all this grief. With death being such a prominent part of the comic, I'm always very hesitant to speak with authority on what that experience looks like and how it feels for the people involved, because for me it's a fine line between sincerely broaching a complex subject and using it as a form of exploitation of the heart. That's why what I try to do mostly in my comics is explore how it feels through the lens of Pink Reaper. Not only is that something none of us can know, but it really tries to make the focus about the character of this person,
not the many human lives that could be affected by such a subject. And I might have an idea for a comic like this at any point really, and I'll write them down and I'll put them somewhere until I'm ready to draw them. And it's oftentimes when I want to try something artistically new or a certain type of image that I'll draw those comics up, because comics like these don't usually need a lot of motion or artistic complexity, so there has to be something beautiful about them to make them worth drawing at all. In this case, it was this fourth panel where I knew I wanted to kind of have a tilted up camera towards the sky and Pink Reaper looking at the sky with this gradient rolling off towards the horizon. It's something I see Adventure Time do a lot, which is why I wanted to try it myself. And you can see that I had to do a gradient for the steepest colour roll off, but to really sell the waviness, I ended up using a different coloured brush for these passes at the top, because I didn't want a gradient, I wanted that rolling kind of sky effect that they do in Adventure Time. It's something I've got better at doing since I made this comic. Here's another example on the screen for you, but I do think it works in this comic as well. I also remember when I originally posted this that there was some confusion about the line going through Timmy's face. I guess that's the risk you run when you have semi-opaque images, but of course what I'm trying to convey is that he's fading away, and perhaps Pink Reaper is not having this conversation in the moment like we think, but they're having it much later in time, or perhaps it's something they repeat to themselves quite often. That's another trope I explore with Pink Reaper, spanning the lengths of their conversations over many, many years. Because for an eternal being like Pink Reaper, time is so much more subjective than it is for me and you. It's a downer episode. I shouldn't have done this on Friday, huh? But hey, sad comics deserve some love too, and if you liked this comic the most out of the 4 I've discussed this week, just make sure you show it some love on my main comics account at Something Phantastic. This account, of course, is the place for all that behind the scenes stuff where I talk more about my comics process, and I'm planning to have 4 more videos for you next week, so please follow, and hopefully I'll see you then. Have a good weekend. Bye. Almost any webcomic worth its salt needs cute characters and, if possible, cute animals. I'm no exception to that rule. In today's comic, we're going to look at one of Phantastic's cutest characters, Socks the cat. So here we have it. Socks the cat. Creatively named by me because it's a cat that wears socks. Artistically, I don't feel like there's a whole lot to discuss here. I think the joke is funny and it works well enough, and there's not really much experimentation that I can reveal. Though I do think I've drawn Winnie and Pink much better in other comics. They look kind of janky in this one, in my opinion. The only detail I noticed when reviewing this canvas file is that I originally had the message as this: just say yes. But I guess I thought that ultimately just agree was punchier. I think I prefer this, but let me know what you think. I also want to note that Socks does me a great service, because having a cute character, like I mentioned in the intro, is really useful when you go to Comic-Cons and you have merchandise to sell. Even if people don't read my comic, Socks, the cat with the dagger in his mouth, usually is something that flies off the shelves, something people enjoy. And I had fun modifying this design when I was making my card game, because the card itself comes out looking pretty neat, in my opinion. Do you have a preference? Maybe let me know. The glittery, shiny sticker, or my favourite, the collectible card. So yeah, I think Socks could do quite well in this tournament, but Socks will only do well if you vote for the comic they feature in over on @SomethingPhantastic. Just show it some love over there, but make sure you still follow here, because I've got 3 more comics to talk about this week, so I hope to see you tomorrow. Bye. Here's a PSA, don't feed ducks bread. That was what I saw in the comments when I first posted this comic, and I'm sure I'm going to see it again this week. Let's take a closer look at why I even did that in the first place. Here we are. The main thing I wanted to discuss today was that I don't think the impact that I have in this third panel is particularly effective. I think it's okay. I think the action lines help a little bit, but one thing I've been trying to improve upon is rely less on action lines and instead on the drawing of frames that have action in them. So what I mean is this. Sometimes if you have an object in your scene and it's traveling, you might do something like this, and you might especially do something like that if it's a webcomic, a little action line. But I've been reading a lot of manga recently, and I think what manga does quite well is convey the action without those lines. Usually it's something about the posing or the composition of that shot that makes you feel the action, and the only time you really see those action lines are on points of impact, like it's a character landing on the sidewalk from a great height or punching someone.
This panel is an attempt for me to convey the force of the loaf being thrown without showing a bunch of lines like this. Look how fast I'm moving. The reason I don't think this is particularly effective is because the position of the duck doesn't really show that they're receiving such a large impact. I experimented just before I started filming by taking this panel and then just using the warp tool to bend the duck into a position that shows that it's receiving a lot more force. I just isolated sections and started to bend them around the shape of the loaf. I think something like that helps us understand that while the base of the neck is here, the impact is having such force that the entire shape of the duck is having to kind of warp around it because of the impact that it's having upon them. That's something that the elasticity of cartoon characters can do very well, and I don't think I particularly did it well in this original panel. A lot of those things I discussed are still things that I'm not that great at yet, but I'm trying to get better. I'm going to put an example on the screen from my upcoming book of a moment of action that's way more effective than when I first ever drew it. So hopefully you can see some improvement, and I hope that when that's finished you'll see lots of areas of improvement too. So yeah, another comic featuring Stuart being more mischievous than usual. Give it some love over on @somethingfantastic if you particularly enjoy this comic. And I hope you enjoyed me experimenting a little bit in explaining my methodology as I showed you kind of examples this week. Maybe that's something I can try and do more of. Either way, there are still 2 more behind the scenes videos that I'm going to post this week, tomorrow and the day after, so I hope to see you for those. Bye. Dreams are starting to take shape in Pink Reaper's experience of the subconscious. That's something I really like about today's comic, because even though it is a kind of simple webcomic with a cute takeaway message, there is a bit more going on in the background that I'd like to talk more about. So usually my focus on these videos is to talk about how I did something and why I did it, but this comic's going to be more of a confessional. I really like the backgrounds that I did for this comic, but the truth is I actually just don't really fully understand how I made them. The background is full up of shapes that I drew kind of at random freehand, but then I layered on top of that versions of the shape that are semi-opaque and blurred. These things clip onto each other and add this kind of rolling off gradient that you can see. However, I knew that while I wanted this comic to be bright and glowy, I didn't quite know how to just draw that with my pen onto the iPad. So I used these layer settings to just mix and match with each other until it got the look that I wanted. I could only recreate this by copying this file and mimicking exactly the steps I took. I don't really know how to achieve this. That's a huge benefit that I have as a digital artist compared to someone traditional, and especially as someone who's never been trained in art, I've just kind of muddled and mixed and matched until it ended up looking the way I wanted to. The way I drew the dreamscape in that comic has a function as well as just looking pretty. You might remember, and I'll put it on the screen too, that the first ever comics where Pink Reaper was dreaming, the background was white. That was because they weren't particularly familiar with the idea of self-actualization and what they even had the capacity to fill their own dreams with. I'm using dreams as a way to convey where Pink Reaper is in their journey of becoming a fully fledged person, essentially. And because this comic comes after those first ever ones, the dreamscape is not completely crystallized, and Pink Reaper still doesn't know exactly what they can achieve, but it is starting to fill with notions and ideas and emotions, and that's why I wanted to have this swirling multicolored shapes in the background to show that things are formulating and things are starting to grow. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm enjoying playing with the dream world aspect of Phantastic, and I hope you enjoy seeing those kind of things. If you liked this comic, just make sure you're voting for it over on @somethingfantastic, and hang around here because there's still one more comic to talk about this week, so I hope to see you tomorrow for that. Bye. Today's comic is an oldie, but hopefully a goodie, but those older comics especially do have little ways in which they can be improved, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. This comic is so old that I don't actually have the file for it anymore. I think it was on my first ever iPad. The only observation I really want to make about the artwork in this comic is that I don't know why I've got so much empty space. 4-panel comics are already pretty hard to operate in, so I don't know why I've constrained myself to this amount of the square. I suspect the reason is that because my old comics were so heavily templated, I probably had a draft that I used for every comic of Timmy on the left and Pink Reaper on the right, and I just drew over that whenever making new comics. I think if I were going to redo this, I would at least scale up the characters to fill that empty space, because it's not really doing anything right now. Something like this, a subtle change that just makes the comic feel a bit more full and a bit more punchy. What do you think? Do you think filling that empty space works for you? Let me know in the comments, and also as a little Friday bonus, I've animated this comic way ago, so I'm going to try and repost that original animation onto both this account and the main comics account, so you can see that if you're interested. So yeah, hope you enjoyed that video and all the videos I posted this week. Next week will be no different. There should be 4 more behind the scenes videos. So I hope that you have voted for the comics you like this week and that you're following here so that when I post more videos next week, you'll see those straight away. Have a good weekend and I'll see you then. Bye. Hey, and welcome back to week 10 of me talking about how I make my comics. Today's talks about the kinship between family members, so let's take a closer look. So one of the challenges that I find in making webcomics is how to convey tone in messages so that it seems varied, whether it seems light or whether it seems serious or whether it seems sarcastic. I do have a few different ways of achieving that, but in this comic, because the tone is lighter, what I wanted to do was convey that lightness of tone through the way the speech bubbles exit the characters' mouths. For me, this wispy line gives you a sense that there's a lighter tone of the words being said. The words are meaningful, but they're not coming out as kind of portentous or serious. I think it might be easier to see why I made that decision if I remove those wispy lines. And here we have the same comic with them removed. And while the comic is functional, for me I do feel that something is lost. The speech bubbles almost feel tacked on like stickers over the top of the comic. I much prefer these wispy lines because it feels like they're really coming out of the character's mouth and almost floating above their heads. The other element of this comic that I didn't talk about is that final panel. I've mentioned before how when a comic is more about the message than it is about the narrative, that I try to finish on something quite spectacular or beautiful in the last panel. That's why this one has those clouds and that light peeking through. I've always loved clouds in the real life and drawing them, and it's something you see in my comics a lot. I'll put the last panel of this comic on screen again, alongside clouds that I've drawn in other comics too. Let me know if you think this comic has the best clouds or if one of the other examples on screen does it better. So if you enjoyed that comic, just make sure you're showing it some love on the main comics account at Something Phantastic, but make sure you're following or you're keeping tabs on this account because I've got 3 more videos this week where I'll talk about the behind the scenes of other comics I've made. So I hope to see you for those. Bye. Today's comic is very light on information I can provide about technique, so instead I'm going to show you things I think I do well and things I don't do so well. Let's take a look. And here we are. Do you think you can tell what I think is successful about this comic and what isn't? For me, it's the landscapes that I've always enjoyed drawing and I think that I do an okay job of. Panels like these full of nature and with the landscape going off into the distance have always been fun for me to enjoy. I love putting the sun behind the mountains, I love the sky gradiating into a darker blue. It's a comforting look that I'm quite comfortable doing. I think if you compare that to the rigidity of this building, it really stands out as a couple of boxes stacked on top of each other. I'll see if I can find an example to put on screen, but generally since I've made this comic, the buildings I draw, I try to just not abide by proportions and rigidity. The squareness of this comic I find particularly jarring and it's something I'll try to avoid. I know I say it at the end of every video, but also make sure you check out this one on my main comics account at Something Phantastic, because whenever I post this, I just hear the sound of a marimba when the masseuse is striking Pink Reaper's bones. I don't think I can see this comic without hearing that sound now, so tell me if you agree or if you think a different sound would be better. So if you like that comic, just make sure you show it some love on at Something Phantastic, where I post all my comics in full, and hang around here too, because I've got 2 more videos coming up this week. Tomorrow I'll be talking about another one in detail, just like today. Hope to see you for that. Bye. Today's comic looks very different from most of the others I talk about. I want to show you why I made that decision and how I achieved that look. Let's take a closer peek. And here we have it. So obviously right away we can tell that I'm not using any line work in this comic. If I'm honest, I don't remember the exact reason why I chose to draw like this, but I'm pretty sure I must have seen something that inspired me to try the same. This comic was both hard and easy to draw. The easy part was that once I had an image that I liked for one panel, I've of course reused it for the others, only changing the facial expression. And the way I did that was by drawing dream schema as I usually do, using very vivid, contrasty colours, just without the line work. The difference is I'm of course applying gradients to this image so that they really roll around dream schema's face and body. For me, Dream Skimmer has always had a very conical head, which I think is probably obvious for the design, but a comic like this really enhances that. I don't think we have them in England, but I'm pretty sure that his head looks like a candy corn. If you haven't had that thought before, I'm sorry now because you might not unsee it. I'll show you quickly what the layers look like for a panel like this. You can see that if I turn off the effects, the image underneath everything is just very simplistic. And it's just the light rolling on and off that really enhances the kind of shape that we're seeing here. I've spoken before about how when I write a sentimental comic, sometimes I feel like I don't want to draw it up until I have an interesting art style or technique I want to try. This is a similar case. I already knew this comic would be visually interesting to some extent because I wanted the tears to rise into the sky. To me, that felt like a very compelling image and something I could only really justify through the dream world. I've actually realised that even though I said that idea could only work in the dream realm, I have used a similar idea before. I did an animation about Stuart reliving some past trauma while he's in the underworld, and because the underworld is so hot and heat makes tears evaporate, I animated it so that a tear would fall and then rise into the sky before fizzling out. So I think that this idea still works as it is, but I just remembered that relationship with that other comic too. Interesting. So yeah, what did you think of that one? Let me know, and if you did enjoy this comic, just make sure you're showing it some love on @somethingfantastic. This comic in particular probably benefits from being seen full screen, with each panel blown up big so you can really kind of see the texture of the image. And because I'm talking about comics through the lens of this tournament I'm running to find my best comic ever, there is still one more in this week's heat, which I'll talk about tomorrow, so I hope to see you for that. Bye. The comic I'm talking about today posed an interesting challenge that I think I need to visually illustrate to really convey my point, so let's take a closer look. Here we are. Of course, the idea I'm playing with here is that we have a saying that you might lose your train of thought if you're talking about something and you kind of forget where you're going. But the good thing about having a comic so full of magic and fun is that I can take these ideas and, when I want to, manifest them physically. The challenge I had with drawing this comic is that trains run on tracks, but that posed two unique problems for this comic. The first is simply a visual matter. Because I'm often putting my characters in pretty nature landscapes, the idea of having a track running through the middle of this comic panel felt to me a bit too heavy and too ugly. So here I've mocked up an example of what I mean. Sure, I could add a rail for the train to run on, it's not too in your face and get away with it, but rails don't sit on top of grass like this. There's probably a layer of mud or something underneath, so we can add that. It's starting to become a bit thick and a bit kind of distracting in my opinion. But train tracks still don't look like this. They actually sit on top of gravel, not mud. The mud is more of a mound that the whole thing is built up upon. So if I'm adding this kind of gravel layer, I've suddenly got this very thick, dark coloured line. I can't really recolour things like stone and mud into bright, pretty colours because then it would just look really weird. You wouldn't even know what I'm drawing. So that's problem number one. Do I really want to have a line cutting through the middle of this comic panel? Ultimately, I decided no. And actually, that goes hand in hand with the second part of making this decision, because actually, if the conceit of this comic is that my characters are looking upon a train made out of imagination that could probably go anywhere, as implied by the fact that it's kind of phasing into reality at the tail carriages, then why would a train like that be constrained to tracks anyway? That might be a form of cope or whatever, but it didn't feel worth pulling that thread and compromising the visuals of this comic because I know the trains in the real world run on tracks. So yeah, what do you think? Do you think that line is distracting, or if I'm just kind of going over the top worrying about things that people who read just don't get bothered by at all? I'll also show you a quick preview because I've got a sequel to this comic exclusively for the book I'm preparing. I'll put a panel of that on the screen now, but keep tabs when I have more news about that. So yeah, tell me what you thought about that comic, and if it is your favourite of the four this week, just make sure you're showing it some love on @somethingfantastic, where I post all my comics in full. Even though that's the last comic of this week's heat, next week I'll be posting again about 4 more comics and talking about them in detail, so I hope to see you for that. Bye. The comic I'm going to talk about today is one of the many that I've redrawn more recently. I'm interested to show you the comparison between how I approached something previously when making comics and how I approach it now. Let's take a closer look. So here's today's comic.
I think it's pretty obvious, and I don't know if I've spoken about it before, but I do like to take the comics that have little life lessons in them and have some kind of visual metaphor. For me, the small potential of a rocket exploding into a beautiful thing in the sky is a good way of conveying this message. But I did mention it previously that I sometimes get teased for this comic because some people, quite rightly so, point out that it's not the cutest idea that little Timmy might be a rocket and explode in the sky himself. Obviously that's not what I mean, but it is funny when I see those comments. I've recently entirely redrawn this comic, and I don't want to show you that whole thing because it's part of that big process I'm doing to make every Phantastic comic that features in my upcoming book look the best it can possibly be. But I will zero in on one of the panels and the differences between this one and the new one. Brightness is much brighter and the darks are much darker. I much prefer the way I overlaid a light gradient over the word boom in this comic too, because it feels much closer to the source of the explosion, and it's so much bigger. I think the impact of that onomatopoeia is way more effective. I'm a little uncertain if I prefer the straightness of the fireworks coming out of the explosion here to convey how close we are to the moment of it exploding, or if I like the panel here where clearly it exploded a few moments ago and the lights are kind of falling and arcing into the ground. While in some ways this looks more like a firework and how it behaves, I chose to go this way because I wanted that moment to be very clearly in tandem with the things that Pink Reaper are saying. So yeah, is it clear to you the ways I think that explosion in the firework has been improved in the redraw compared to the old one? I feel like often when I pose a question like that, people prefer the older one because they like kind of the hand draw element. They don't want it to look as professional as I, as an individual, want to be seen as when I make my comics, if that makes sense. I think even separate to that, even if you do prefer your webcomic to look a bit rougher around the edges, because my focus at the moment is on making a book that is full of high quality drawings that are consistent when you turn each page, that's why it feels important to unify my art style. But it's an interesting thing to consider, and if you have a particular opinion on it, I'd be interested to hear. So do you have a preference? Let me know, and make sure you're following this account because I post 4 videos a week that talk about the behind the scenes of my comics, and I have another one coming up tomorrow. So I hope to see you for that. Bye. Even though there's a difference between dreams and nightmares, in Phantastic, nightmares occur within the dream realm. And today's comic is one of those that features a nightmare, so let's take a look. So in this comic, as I said, we have a nightmare, and nightmares are hard to convey. In an earlier comic in the tournament, I used a kind of glitchy effect, which I wasn't in love with. I actually drew this comic first, and I like how I did the background in this particular panel, where the spookiness and uncertainness is conveyed through a spiral, but I've still put him in a room. You can see that the spiral kind of hugs the wall and floor here. Very simply, that effect is achieved by drawing a spiral and then just kind of cutting it with the selection tool here, and then warping the bottom section so that it kind of fits the shape of a floor, however you've ended up drawing it. There's only one other detail I want to clarify in this comic, and I will say it once. I'm not going to infer anything else, because in the second panel, the bloke is being splashed by water. They have woken themselves up because they have wet themselves. They've gone for a number 1 by accident. A number 1. Okay, so don't quote me on this, but I think that is the last time a Dream Skimmer comic features in this tournament, and I'm recording a few of these in advance. I'm actually in Rome right now. Maybe I'll put a photo in my stories for proof. But if you like Dream Skimmer or you like the Dream Skimmer comics, this might be the last chance to vote it through. If that's something you're interested in doing, just make sure you view the comic in full on @somethingphantastic. It's the comic that has the most likes and comments that goes through in this tournament I'm running. But it's okay if you're undecided. I have 2 more comics to talk about this week, so I'll see you again tomorrow for that. Bye. I've spoken about how I make sad comics before, but today's comic is particularly brutal. Let's take a closer look. And here we have it. I have such a bad tendency to make sad, emotional comics, and this is one of the most impactful, in my opinion, but also according to most people who read the comic. I've spoken in prior behind-the-scenes videos that I play with this idea that Pink Reaper often has conversations that might seem like they're happening in the moment as we read them, but they convey huge spans of time. This is a comic like that, where Pink Reaper is reliving a conversation they're having with Timmy, but that conversation concludes at a very far future point. And there are two things happening in this last panel. This is pretty much the only time I haven't used my traditional soft-edged panel box here. It's my preference that the comics I make don't feel constrained by boxes, and that's why I often overlap the borders of my panels. However, Pink Reaper is so sad in this final panel, I thought it would be interesting to set them inside of a box to really convey that sense of claustrophobia and feeling defeated and imprisoned by their emotions. The other thing that might cross your mind when you read a comic like this is the fact that we have seen the future of the comic. Most of the comic features Timmy as a young boy, but we have seen snippets of the future where he's old and seemingly dies as a happy old man with a family of his own. So it might be jarring to see a version of the future where there is so much destruction in the town that, as far as we knew, would have been fine. There is a narrative reason for that, and it's something that is very far away from being revealed, but one thing that is very fun for me to do as someone that has this very big long-term vision for a webcomic like this is to plant these seeds through comics that might seem innocuous at first, or they might just seem dramatic for effect, like this one. But really, they all tie into a narrative that I have planned to tell for at least a couple more years, and I'm really excited to show you how this all ties together eventually. Okay, so usually I say that if you like a comic, you should vote for it. I don't know if people are going to like this comic per se, but you might have found it powerful or moving, and in that spirit, make sure you let me know on that main comics account at Something Fantastic if it did make you feel that way. However, if you need a palate cleanser and something a bit more like the familiar, light-hearted comics that Phantastic is known for, that's what I talk about tomorrow, so I hope to see you for that. Bye. If you've ever heard of the monkey's paw, you'll be familiar with this idea that wishes kind of have an ironic twist to them after they're granted. I play with that idea in today's comic, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Here we go. So this is a Genie comic. There are many Genie comics where Pink Reaper and Genie interact in unexpected ways. The monkey's paw element I referenced earlier is in the fact that there is not only an ironic twist in this comic, but really Pink Reaper's wish isn't being granted at all. I'm kind of implying this Genie is a con artist. Genie has an interesting position in the comic. Genies are so powerful that I don't really feature the Genie too prominently because there could be so many repercussions to that I will struggle to contain. At a point, in fact, I've actually plumbed in the Genie character into a more fundamental narrative way in the book I'm developing. Speaking of which, I always say, I can't show you the redraws of comics I'm doing for the book because, blah, 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 I want it to be exclusive. But I thought today, this is a simple comic, and I will show you not only the redraw, but the first ever draw of this comic, because this is actually one of the comics that I took from my first ever comics account. On Comics by Night, most of my human characters look like this bloke here, and the Genie, the design actually hasn't changed that much. When I came to redraw it for Phantastic, I of course replaced the man with Pink Reaper, and at the time I was trying to do this thing where you have a very thick line on the outside and thinner lines on the inside. It's something Extra Fabulous does a lot. He's one of my favourite cartoonists in terms of the visual he has on screen, but honestly, I don't think I really nailed it for this one. So when it comes to redrawing it for the book, I'm leaning back into the style I'm most comfortable with and the way I think Phantastic looks best. In some ways this looks traced, but actually you can see that not only is the line weight consistent, but the proportions are much fixed, and Genie now has pointy ears, which is just something I wanted to build into its character because it's essentially a djinn, which is the Genesis word for genie and that kind of character creation. I know that I bring up this book a lot and it might be getting boring when your main interest in these videos is seeing how I do something, but I do want these videos to also convey the thought process I have into any kind of work I make. It has not been an insignificant task to update so many old comics so that the book becomes a unified product, and that is important to me because I want people to feel rewarded if they choose to spend any of their hard-earned money on something that I've made. So I hope it's interesting. Good news is we're quite near the tail end of round 1 of the tournament, and I don't want to repeat myself in future behind the scenes videos, so we're kind of bringing all that to an end, which might be a relief to some of you. So that's the last comic of this week. If you enjoyed this comic the most, just make sure you're voting for it over on @somethingfantastic. I'll let you know on Monday which comic from this week went through out of the 4, and then I'll just talk about 4 more. Until then, have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Bye. Don't live, laugh, love, die, cry, hate. Let's look at another comic. I think it's fun when I acknowledge that Pink Reaper, despite all their wholesomeness as a character, still had a very dark past, and they're not necessarily always ashamed of it. They felt grim, but they're not necessarily regretful. They were the manifestation of death for most of their existence before Phantastic started. So it's fun to lean into that, especially with punchlines that are incredibly subtle, when just an element of the background is the thing that's changing. Like this. In fact, the way I even came up with that comic idea at first was with the concept of the poster, not the comic itself. And so, of course, I made one and then reverse engineered made the comic afterwards. I sold this at conventions for a short while after making the comic, and of course they sold out. I think it's very funny. It's not necessarily in keeping with the tone of the comic. When put in 4 panels it is, but as a poster on a table, I did notice a few odd looks from the kind of younger readers or the families I have who read the comic, who would then see this poster-sized print of die, cry, hate, quite strong words. And it's kind of anecdotal, but I did notice the people who bought it and weren't necessarily people who were that interested in other items I had at my table. That's why I don't sell this particular print anymore, but maybe from time to time in the future I'll do a limited run if anyone wants to see it. So, did you live, laugh, love that comic? Anyway, if you did, just keep in mind that I post all my comics on my main comics account at Something Phantastic. So if you want to leave it a like or a comment, that's the place to do it. Stay following here though, because I have 3 more videos about other comics coming up this week. I'll see you for those. Bye. As someone who has historically made a high volume of webcomics, sometimes you'll look at ideas you have and realize that each independent joke that you have isn't necessarily worthy of a full comic or making a big deal about. Today's comic is something like that, where I wanted to execute an idea that I felt was funny, but it wasn't really quite worth making a comic about, so I ended up combining 2 ideas instead, and I'll show you how I did that. I've made a fair few comics where pieces of Pink Reaper fall apart. In fact, I'll show you another one on screen right now. It's a fun and reliable trope to have a head or an arm or whatever fall off and make some kind of joke about it, because Pink Reaper is the most malleable character in Phantastic that can do that kind of thing. That said, I didn't know if I really felt like having a literal head in the clouds was worth a 4-panel comic of its own. The reason for that is because I draw on 4 panels before I convert anything to 9 panels like this. I couldn't see a convenient way to fit the punchline in. I originally started with this panel, then this panel, then this panel, and then I kind of had this void 4th panel. I'd already got my punchline out, and then it wasn't that satisfying to finish the comic with just the head continuing to fall. Of course, usually punchlines come in the 4th panel, but imagine that this comic essentially looks like this. Just stating that your head is in the clouds, I don't think is really that satisfying for any webcomic reader. A lot of webcomics just conjure up a kind of sniff laugh or a half chuckle, but this one didn't even quite get to that point, for me at least. So when I thought on it and had it in my drafts for a while, I realised that of course as a character who loved bones, it's bones. And like in that comic I showed you just a moment ago, there's no one more excited to see bones around where they are, certainly if they fall from the sky. Jokes like this work for me because instead of it being a setup and punchline, the punchline is more to do with something that Bones seems to have secretly thought about in their own time. And even if it isn't the most hearty chuckle you'll ever have, by combining those 2 ideas, I think this one comic is much more effective. Making comics like this are a reminder too of the awkwardness of presentation. Usually I'm trying to edit any idea I have down into 4 panels, which is a challenge in itself. But the same can be true when I'm trying to bulk out a 9-panel comic. This comic was 8 panels long when I first made it, and I realized as I was formatting comics for my upcoming book that it needed to be a square, like all the other comics in the book. That's when I added that top left panel. And in terms of information that it's giving you, it's obviously not offering much. It seems functionally just like a panel to make the whole comic a square. But actually, I realized after making it that it does improve the comic because we have a slight indication of how the comic will ultimately end, and it better places our location of the comic in the sky.
Something like that is a happy accident, and it's just as pleasant of a surprise when it happens now as when it happened even more often when I started.
So as usual, if you like that comic, just make sure you like it, leave a comment or something like that on my comics account at Something Fantastic. I'm posting there 4 times a week, and I'm posting here 4 times a week with the behind the scenes thoughts of how I make things. So keep tabs on both places if you're interested in the comic making process, and I'll hopefully see you again tomorrow. Bye. Vegeta, Snape, Kylo Ren. We all like seeing bad guys who end up softening toward the end of their arc and doing something good. The baddies in my comic aren't really as bad as the guys I've mentioned, but Socks the Cat, a previous winner in my comics tournament, is in today's comic, showing their more playful side. Let's have a look. And here we have that comic, and like I said, Socks isn't the biggest baddie you're ever going to see in Phantastic, but it is fun to put them with someone who is probably one of the most optimistic characters. Sure, Timmy and Pink have very philosophical conversations about the nature of happiness, but Bones is more dim-witted kind of happy. And I enjoyed with this comic having the dialogue come as thought bubbles, something you see in something like Garfield, but still having the onomatopoeia of the cat sounds and the dog sounds underneath, just to remind everyone reading that even though we're kind of understanding what's happening, because I have to let you know it's my comic, they aren't communicating in a way anyone else will understand. That, for me, adds a little bit of charm to a comic like this, especially one that's not that fundamentally complicated. And for that same reason, I added a bit of extra detail in the background, like the city behind the hill that's always there, and the falling autumn leaves, one of my favourite things to draw in backgrounds.
I referenced a few bad characters who ended up softening up at the intro of this video. Can you name any more notable examples? I'm drawing on my nostalgia primarily with those things like Dragon Ball Z or Harry Potter, those franchises I grew up with, but I bet there's so many more recent examples too. If you let me know in the comments, I'll check a few out.
I imagine it's a potent combo having 2 cute animals in one comic, so my theory is that this comic might be the one to advance this week. But as always, only the comics that are the most engaged with on my comics that count are the ones that advance in the tournament. So just make sure you're checking out my comics on @somethingfantastic. I'm posting there in parallel every time I post here too. So leave it a like or let me know what you enjoyed about the comic if this is your favourite this week. It's okay if you're undecided because I have one more video coming tomorrow. I'll see you for that. Bye. When the Grim Reaper is portrayed more sensitively in other pieces of media or my own comic, we often rally for them and get to understand that they're a lovable character. That's our perspective, not the one shared by everyone who sees a spooky skeleton walking around every day. That's the essential premise of today's comic. So let's take a closer look. I'll keep this one quick as it's not the most complex comic I've discussed this week, but of course, Pink Reaper, being the representation of death in the world of Phantastic, is going to be slightly at odds with someone called the Lifeguard. So when they're visiting the pool, while Timmy is vibing, of course, all the other people swimming are going to be keeping their distance from a big, walking, talking skeleton. That's kind of it with this comic. The only thing I can say that I remember when making it is that sometimes I take too long to make comics. I reference a lot of my previous ones and I kind of steady my hand as much as possible to make sure comics are as consistent as possible, especially more recently. I became aware of that at some point and I tried to speed draw this one without any reference, which is why you can kind of see some exaggerated proportions here. They're more expressive. And actually, while I am in general trying to unify my art style to something quite clean and like production equivalent-y, I do like that there is a quickness to this comic that you can see in the uneven edges of Pink Reaper's head here and the overheight of their shoulders. That's something I'm trying to balance as I make more comics, retaining the elasticity and fun that comes inherently with cartooning, while also bringing my art style up to a point where it feels more professionally done.
The title Lifeguard is kind of weird, isn't it, when you think about it? I mean, even other jobs that require protection of some kind use the verb of that thing, like policing, or they are the security of a building. Is Lifeguard the only job title where the missive is indicated in the role? Guard life? Feels like you're putting such an onus on that person, especially when it only seemingly applies to swimming pools. Don't know how that happened, but if anyone knows the etymology of that word, then let me know, I'd be interested.
And with that, we're done. This is the last comic I'm going to talk about this week. Relatedly, we actually only have 2 more weeks left of round 1 of this tournament. I've structured it in a way that now we're almost through round one, the final 2 rounds will be very concise. I'm conscious that I'm going to be revisiting comics I've already discussed in this kind of format, so do let me know if there are things that you want me to talk more about my comics in general, or the winners that have gone through in previous weeks. However, there's still 2 more weeks of round 1 to go, so I'll have a regular video like these talking about brand new comics next week. I hope to see you then. Bye. Just cut to the action. That's a rule I'm trying to abide by more in my webcomic, because I only have 4 panels to play with anyway. Sometimes you need to just place your readers inside of an adventure. It matters less the context as to how they got there in the first place. That detail is relevant to the comics I want to show you today, so let's have a closer look. So this is actually a 2-parter comic, which you'll have realised if you've already seen the full thing. And this first part isn't so much about cutting to the action like I introed the video with, but it does still put us in the middle of an adventure. You can see that our characters are halfway walking to somewhere. That's something I enjoy doing with Phantastic. Because I'm in this big mythical setting, I have found it less important over time to say, oh hey Timmy, do you want to go on an adventure to the underworld? Oh yeah, let's go. If I just put my characters in that location, the characters and the setting are so well established already that readers will already kind of know what's going on, and they're just along for the ride, and I hope that usually they'll trust that the payoff is worth it. I posted this quite a long time after I posted that first comic, and I just had another idea of how to develop it. What I just said is equally more true. We're in the middle of a battle, and it really doesn't matter that I've established that Stuart is going on some kind of conquest or anything like that. We are just in the comic, and I don't think I really require any more setup than I've given. Readers have probably forgotten that Timmy claimed the underwear in that previous comic, so the payoff of this one is something for longer term readers or ones who remember the details. I've got to admit I'm cheating a little bit this week, because usually this tournament is structured to help you vote and find the best single comic that I've made in Phantastic so far. That said, a lot of my other best comics are part of narrative arcs that have developed over time, and I want to do a separate tournament for that. This comic is somewhere in the middle. It's a 2-parter comic, so it doesn't really feel like a series, but it is definitely longer than most of the comics in this tournament. So maybe that length will help it as you get a clearer sense of the joke. People seem to enjoy longer comics than shorter comics, I find more recently. So yeah, I don't really mind that I'm breaking my own rules, but just a reminder that I do want to talk about the longer term storytelling I've done on Phantastic too. So if that's of interest, I hope you hang around this account, because I've got a lot more videos that I want to make and put out for you soon. So what did you think about today's comic? Maybe you liked the fact it was a little longer. In fact, the winner of last week's round of the tournament was the longest comic of the week. If this was your favourite, as usual, just give it a like, maybe even a comment on @somethingphantastic, the place I post all of my comics. I have 3 more videos though to discuss this week on this account, so I hope you follow, and I'll see you tomorrow for the next one. Bye. This is your last chance to save a cute dog, a cartoon dog. Bones, the one from my webcomic. I'm doing a tournament thing where the best comic goes through, and the dog ones haven't done that well yet, so look, right, attention grabbing opening aside. The only comic that even features Bones the dog was in last week's tournament, and it wasn't even the main function of that comic, so let's take a closer look at a Bones-centric comic, and I'll show you why I think it works. I'm often having to consider the amount of work it's worth putting into some comics over others. Recently, as I develop a more narrative continuity for Phantastic, for me it is important to ground the characters in a sense of place and time. However, when I started making comics, especially the ones like these, my focus was on charming messages, something that was shareable, even maybe stuff that had meme potential. When the message of my comic is the literal message that I'm putting in front of you, I think that the focus should not be on the background. It's really about getting your point across as clearly and as quickly as possible. That's why I have many comics like this, which is more about that kind of tone. I still want to do comics like this as I move forward. It's not only a nice breather for me as someone who makes quite a lot of stuff, but it's also just nice to make something nice, and you don't need to overthink every little thing. I don't know how many of the people on this account are new followers who have found me through my discussions of making comics, and how many people have just come over because they've already read Phantastic. But I would be interested to see if any of you have an opinion on the difference between when I post like a meme shareable comic like the one I'm discussing today versus building the adventure over time.
I would definitely say that my most engaged audience, despite having a slightly smaller follower count, is the Webtoon audience, who have been very responsive in the surveys I've done, and they have helped guide my hand as they confirm that they really like the storytelling approach that Phantastic has morphed into over the years. Which is an interesting dynamic, because on Instagram I have a bigger following, and I imagine the comics that are more memey and more simple to decode are the ones that are the most popular. So then you kind of have this tension between two audiences who want two different types of things. And I know that for me, I primarily want to tell stories, but if you have come to this account and you have a slightly different opinion to what I've outlined, I'd be interested to hear it.
So, if you love dogs and you want this comic to go through in the tournament, just leave it a like or a comment on @something Phantastic where the full comic is posted. I know I had that clickbaity opening, and while it is true that True Bones comic hasn't gone through yet, this week is actually really stacked, same as next week, because we're at the end of the first round. Both the seedings from the top and the lowest seedings, they meet in the middle, and so that means that this week and next week are incredibly evenly scored, in my opinion. So if you are unsure, just keep following here. I'm going to talk about 2 more comics this week, so I hope to see you tomorrow. Bye. While a young boy's relationship with death is the center point of my webcomic, quite often too, Timmy, the young lad, he has other supernatural friends in the comic too, and I've quite enjoyed more recently pairing him with Stuart. I think the reason for that is their relationship with Pink is a place to talk about big ideas and maybe even seed some melancholy tones into the comics I make. Oh, a magpie. But with Stuart, I often have a bit more edge in those comics. I had one maybe 2 weeks ago that kind of demonstrates that point. But Timmy's charms are hard to resist, and despite what I said, even he can soften the most bristly characters in my comic like Stuart, and that's exactly what happens in today's. So let's take a look. And here we have it, even though Timmy is actually only appearing in that final panel here. We've seen Stuart develop a lot over the course of Phantastic since I've been posting, especially more recently since before I started doing this set of tournament videos, he recently concluded a romantic arc with Winnie the Witch. And a comic like this is an interesting kind of middle point for his character development, because we can tell that Stuart in some ways misses being feared as the monster he was so clearly seen as, but really in his heart of hearts he doesn't mind the love that he's now given from the other characters in Phantastic. Something I go back and forth on when I draw additional characters who aren't the main cast is how to portray them. Sometimes I put them in all white with no colours or notable features to just highlight the fact that these aren't going to appear anywhere else. These are kind of the NPCs of Phantastic comics. That's not a rule I strictly abide to, but it's something I try to do just so that the main roster of characters as it grows doesn't get conflated with other characters who appear, and I don't want you to mistake them for someone important. I made a really weird error when I posted this comic originally. I remember that because the joke is around the pronunciation of stupid, when I sounded that out phonetically and I originally posted this comic, I wrote it as stupid. I did that intentionally because even though I know stupid is spelled differently, I felt that by sounding it out in that way, I felt that it made the intention much clearer of the person who's teasing Stuart. That said, people caught it immediately, and I don't think I needed to have overthought that particular joke delivery as much as I did, so I have fixed it for this repost if you notice the difference there. So if you like that comic, just make sure you're voting for it. Leave a comment or a like or something like that on @something Phantastic. I'm always going to be posting my comics there, even if I don't make behind the scenes videos here as well. There's just one more video to talk about this week, so I hope you're following and I hope that you watch it tomorrow. Then you're going to make an informed vote on the best comic I posted this week. I'll see you for that. Bye. When I made this particular comic, I not only liked the joke, but I didn't realize at the time that it would feed into this whole big side adventure. I'm going to talk about how I made today's comic specifically in a moment, but I also have so much more to say about it, so keep watching till the end and I'll give you that broader context too, and hopefully it'll inform how you vote for this week. So this comic actually has quite an interesting history. What you're seeing now is a redraw from my old comics account, Comics by Night. That's a place I used to experiment with a lot of random ideas, and it just so happened I was interested in making jokes about magic at that time too. It felt like a good fit to redraw for the Pink Reaper universe at the time, now Phantastic. In fact, you can see them in the background here. And honestly, even though I've revisited this comic a few times now, it is one of my favourite pieces of wordplay. I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as a
particularly strong joke writer, but I was very happy with the punchline of this joke, playing on the staff of tropes being turned into magical wands, something that I had always established Winnie as carrying. In fact, that wand detail is the reason I revisited this comic again and found its home inside of a much longer zine that I've made. There it is for you. Or maybe I'll put a pop-up on screen if it's not that particularly clear. It's really fun for me to make jokes and find their place in a bigger Phantastic canon over time, and this comic is a really good example of that. In fact, I have even more to say about it, but I'll explain what I mean in a moment. So yeah, did you like that comic as well? I actually have so much more to say about this comic and the kind of zine that I made as a result of it. So secretly, I'm hoping that this wins this week so that I can talk more about that process of zine making, magazine, zine. That's especially relevant because I am probably going to do another tournament after this one that focuses not on single panel comics like this tournament, but on narrative adventures that I've told with multiple 4-panel comics over time. The zine that this comic inspired isn't going to be part of that. That's a 30-page book. So while it will be a whole chapter in my upcoming published book, it's not something I'm really going to talk about in this tournament because it's so long and it just would take too much time. So that's my endorsement. Hopefully you vote this one through this week, but if another one was your favourite, that's fine too. As usual, I'll have 4 more comics to talk about next week. That's the final heat for round 1 of the tournament, so I hope to see you for that. Bye. I have this cute character in my comic, Ghosty, and the way I draw them now is quite different to how I used to draw them. If we look at the original comic first, you can see that I used black line work and the swirl on the back of their head was a lot smaller than it is in the redraws. The swirl is actually a little homage to how I draw Pink Reaper because that's how I also draw the material on the back of their hood where it bunches up. The most notable difference with this one, of course, is also that I now use a blue line for Ghosty. I do that to try and convey their etherealness and that they're this mystical floating creature. I draw everything else with black outlines already, so I felt that Ghosty had a good reason to be drawn differently to everyone else. In hindsight, it feels kind of obvious to make him blue, right? He's this magical floating creature, whereas even though the other characters are Phantastic, they do have magical capacity. They aren't essentially magic like Ghosty is. And one last thing, the reason I'm showing you the redraw is because I redrew this comic for my upcoming book, and even though Ghosty is the star of the show here, it gave me a chance to redraw the background in that final panel too. I much prefer not using line work in backgrounds these days. I think it looks so much nicer and it also helps the characters pop out in front of that background. It's nice to have discovered all these various ways to redo things over the years and improve my quality of drawing over time. I think it's the reason why a lot of the things I discuss in these videos seem subtle, but when you see the cumulative effect of so many redraws, so many improved and finessed comics, you realize that the effect is much greater than the sum of its parts. That's important for me as someone who's already been making comics for a long time but hopes to continue doing so. You hope that the thing as a whole ultimately is what people remember of the thing you make. Probably more so than each individual little comic. You probably know by now that the reason I'm talking about the comics I make is because I'm running this big tournament to find the best one I've made over the last 5 or 6 years. You can see this comic in full on @somethingphantastic where I post all my comics, but I'd recommend hanging around here as well because I have 3 more videos coming for the rest of this week. Hopefully, I'll see you tomorrow. Bye. In my comic, Pink Reaper is one of the wisest beings in the comic because they're the personification of death, and aside from looking kind of cute in their pink robe, they've seen so much and they have a lot of wisdom to offer. But long-time readers will know that actually the thing that really enhances Pink Reaper's perspective is how the world is viewed by their best friend Timmy, a young mortal boy. That dynamic is essential to a lot of the comics in Phantastic, including the one I want to take a closer look at today. Once again, we find ourselves on the hill that so many of my comics are based on, and I've always enjoyed drawing the tree and the ground like this. However, unlike most comics that usually take 4 panels to complete, instead of ending on a sentimental note, this comic ends on a silly gag where Pink Reaper has no eyes. I really love being sentimental and sincere in my comics, but I never want to forget that the main reason I started making comics was to make really silly throwaway humour, and this is a good combination of both of the techniques that I've ended up leaning into over the years. But I probably should mention this is not the first time I've made a joke about Pink Reaper not literally having eyes. Here's another comic that I don't think is in the tournament, unless I talked about it ages ago, but essentially it's the same punchline. And did you notice too how whack the eye sockets are in that final panel? The reason I do that is because as I've improved as an illustrator over the years, I've really tried to improve my smooth line work.
I've mentioned before that I hope that my comics ultimately end up looking like a still frame from an animation. And I don't really use many drawing assists that Procreate has, but I have had it sometimes remarked on that the comics look incredibly clean and almost too digital. One of the things I've done to try and meet that clean style in with the kind of hand-drawn element is whenever I draw Pink Reaper's eye sockets, I just try to freehand a circle and resist any temptation to redo it. That often results in me having kind of wonky and very uneven eye shapes, but it adds a layer of kind of unpredictability of how Pink Reaper might look in any single panel of the comic, which actually is really important because Pink Reaper's a skeleton and they could just look incredibly rigid, and I don't want a cartoon that I'm making to entertain people to feel rigid and stale or anything like that.
So as always, just let me know if you liked this comic, either by going to the comics account at Something Fantastic or letting me know here. I'm actually keen to get a few more comments this week because this is the last round of the tournament I'm running. I'm going to be taking a break from these structured kind of videos for the next couple of weeks. I'm hoping that I can kind of treat this downtime as a way to still make videos in a different way by replying to your comments with little kind of recorded video things. So if you'd like to learn more about how I make comics or find out something about me in a general sense, leave a comment here or in any of the videos this week and I'll aim to reply to as many as I can with these little video note things. All that's for a future time anyway. I've still got 2 more videos this week, so I hope you hang around and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye. It can be tricky to draw see-through characters, especially when the aesthetic of my comic is using bold, flat colours. There are going to be moments where I have to make concessions. Do I show them in all white, like you kind of would typically illustrate a ghost? Or do I want to emphasise the fact that Ghosty is see-through? I often do both, and I'll give you some examples now. So, this is the comic I am posting over on my comics account at Something Fantastic. This is a pretty old comic, and the main giveaway for that is that everything is drawn in a black outline. I established in Tuesday's video that I draw Ghosty in a blue outline these days. You can also tell that in this one, very, very subtly, I have made Ghosty semi-transparent. When I draw comics these days, I try to not go into such a level of subtlety. When I drew this, I felt it was important to make Ghosty see-through, but really it doesn't read that clearly and it doesn't really emphasize any aspect of the comic, especially when in the third panel I make it incredibly obvious that Ghosty is see-through by turning the opacity way down. If you compare that to how I've drawn these 2 panels in the redraw for my upcoming book, you'll see that I've chosen to use block white for this first panel, and it's only in this third panel where I'm trying to emphasize the point that he's see-through. When it comes to making Ghosty look see-through, there's 2 other little things I do. In this panel from Tuesday's video, I didn't talk about it then, but you can see the action line from the baseball is knocked back when it's going through Ghosty. I think a choice like that helps sell the fact that Ghosty is semi-opaque. And I also use the same effect sometimes for speech bubbles. Here's some examples on screen. Those make no sense because, of course, contextually the speech bubbles aren't existing in the same world as the characters, but I just really like how it looks. And I think part of the joy of cartooning is establishing little rules and quirks like that just because it looks nice or it makes the comic you're reading feel a bit more charming. I've now spoken about Ghosty twice this week, so that's your lot for him. But tomorrow's comic features Stuart again, and in this instance, in a frozen version of the underworld. So I hope to see you tomorrow for that. Bye. There's a demonic character in my comic called Stuart, who, as you can see in these examples I'm putting on screen, is nowhere near as scary as they used to be. I'm going to show you an example now of the first time I kind of started exploring that aspect of their character in my long-running webcomic. Now, when I first drew this comic, I thought the most notable thing would be how I drew the frozen flames in the background. That was just a little bit of a faff because you have to draw lots of individual kind of straight lines and make very customized shape. Usually the way I draw is a lot more fluid and smooth. But as it turns out, often when this gets posted, people talk about Stuart's agape mouth here. I totally get it because it reads like a dark mustache, which is not something I had really considered when drawing it originally. I haven't actually bothered to modify this comic, but whenever I draw Stuart with his mouth open now, I use the same dark colour from his horns, and then it's very clearly the inside texture of his mouth. Lesson learned. This comic also had an unexpected lore implication because I refer to hell, but really in Phantastic, that kind of place is known as the underworld. The reason for that is this comic was made slightly before I'd really put all that effort into establishing definitive locations and character development over time. But I didn't want to waste this comic because I do quite like the gag.
long story short, I've established that hell kind of was a place that existed in the past, but now the same place is also known as the underworld. And I go into a little bit more detail about that kind of thing in my short story, Immortal Love. I don't know how airtight logically all my establishing of stuff like that is, but I have tried to make an effort to bring it all in together to the same place.
So that was the last comic of round one. I've been doing this for months now, but the way I've structured it is because I don't want to repeat myself every week as I refine the amount of comics in the tournament down and down and down. There's only going to be 3 rounds. So that means all of these winners are going to face off, and then whatever's left, the 4 or 5 after that, from those you'll choose the winner. And I also mentioned that there was some kind of lore context in the short stories I write for this comic in particular. If you are interested in that kind of thing, my website is the same as my handle on my main comics account. It's somethingphantastic.com. There I have links to my comics on all my platforms, including short stories, and I also have grouped my comics by character. If you just want to get to know a character like Stuart, for example, there's a lot of material to play with there, including the entire wiki I wrote for my comic, which almost no one reads, and it took me ages to do, but I hope that if one day this comic pops off, a resource like that will be useful. Usually I sign off by saying that I'll see you next week on Tuesday, but I'm not really sure how the cadence of videos are going to go in between round 1 and round 2, so I'll just see you in a bit.